I'm still John and this is my dear friend, but now you are a dear friend, Dr. Steven Moffic. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Steve. You could actually call me today, you could call me Dr. Jazz because that's my old pen name when I was reviewing jazz albums 50 years ago.
Wow,
And jazz is
50.
back in the news. So,
Yeah, cool. Let's talk about that then. Let's talk about jazz and the implications of jazz and where we are in the modern world.
yeah, I think, yeah, it's such a surprise for me to find out that our new leader of the Democratic Party is a jazz fan,
Mm.
big jazz fan. And I found out via a publication coming out of England. It's called The Conversation. One of
Ah,
my favorite things to read each day. They usually have 4 or 5 articles and often cover things that doesn't come out in the United States press. So this morning they had this article about her and her love of jazz and mentioned among other things, 3 records she bought last year from a store in Washington, D.C. And the titles proved to me that it was really true. So one of them was Charles Mingus, Let Your Children Hear Music, or some title like that. The other was Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald doing their version of Porgy and Bess.
yeah.
And if a person likes that range of jazz, they're a real jazz fan. There's
Mm.
no question about it. So, and I've written about jazz on and off for Psychiatric Times, and so I'll probably do it again. But it also, I think there's so many important things about it. Number one, it's Black Americans' contribution not only to the United States in the uniqueness of jazz, but to the world. There's no other music that's valued in as many countries as jazz. And for the authoritarian countries like Russia and China, it's been banned on and off. But actually, before the communists in China, jazz was loved. The swing music was really popular in China, but once Mao came and his successors, it's been essentially banned again. So there's something really important about what the music does, besides having been put together by African Americans. But I think it's a model for how people relate to one another because of the improvisation. That's how we talk to each other, the
Mm.
kind of improvisation that happens in jazz. And I think because of what we've talked about sometimes in your expertise, I think it's anti-cult. I wouldn't call it an antidote or really a preventive measure for cults, but I say it's anti-cult because you can't use jazz to control people's thinking. Number one, it's mainly instrumental, although like with Porgy and Bess, there's some songs with words that are used, but it's instrumental and it's free. So you can't control somebody by using that music. So um, I think it has that sort of special importance in that way too. In a way, its own diversity and improvisation basis makes it hard for people to love it because it's not easy to get hooks that make you feel comfortable in listening to it. But I'll continue to do everything I can to get people interested in the music and I think it may take on importance again right now. I think it's a reflection of everything this nominee is all about and represents, I think, the future of America. So,
Yeah, and one of the aspects in jazz covers all possible emotions, but certainly when we go back to the swing period, it's a joyful music. And I
yeah,
think that's another reason why it's not useful for authoritarian cults because they tend to be drab and humorless. And
yeah,
the idea of improvising when you're actually meant to be following a strict rule book and doing as you're told. Um, I
yeah,
regard Louis Armstrong as one of the greatest human beings who ever lived. Um,
yeah,
Ken Burns in jazz. You know, there's this story of this lad who, what, at 11 years old, he's in a remand home for boys because I think when he was 8, he ran out in the street and fired a gun because he was a bit happy, and he ended up going to this place. And it said that whenever he went back to New Orleans, he would go and visit the boys' home, and he would lie on the cot that had been his cot. So this is one of those very unusual experiences where a child has been put in a home, and actually it was useful to him, it was good for him. But when he was 11 years old, he was working for a coal merchant, a Jewish coal merchant. Yes. And they were so pleased with him that they said, "We'd like to buy something for you. What do you want?" And he said, "I'd like a cornet." Mm-hmm. And legend has it, he just picked it up and played. Who knows? But there was just something natural about him. He's not the inventor of jazz. You know, there are all sorts of arguments about where jazz came from. We don't really know. We do know that it was spelled with 2 S's at the end for some time, jazz. And we know that it means pretty much the same as the word rock, which is not used in polite circles. It's a sexual.
Oh, yeah, it had sexual implications.
Primal music.
Right? Yeah.
But there's a transformation that happens, I think, with Sidney Bechet and with Louis Armstrong. These two guys, they just do this amazing thing. Armstrong, Duke Ellington said that he wished he had 11 Louis Armstrongs to play in his band because he was the most creative musician in the world. And so he invents it, and you have to think about this. This is a wild thing, that people learn to play music and they play it from the score, and they, you know, there it all is, and you get some brilliant guy like Gustav Mahler or Jean Sibelius, and they write this stuff, and it's all practice, and we do all of this stuff. Armstrong had to invent the music while he was playing. He's one of the, and Bechet as well. So he is actually, when you listen to the Hot Fives and Sevens from the late 20s, he's actually making the music up. There's a basic theme, what traditionally was called a tenor in the music, but he's actually creating new melodies while he plays. Then he also, of course, it pretty much invents jazz singing. So,
well, and a special kind of jazz singing, because I think there was some tune he was singing on and he forgot the words, and he just
the sheet fell from that they were recording, and the word sheet fell off the.
It just started scatting, making up syllables.
Invented scat singing, yeah, and so on and so forth.
Good.
Yeah,
I like it.
You can buy my record later. But I mean, and this story, which I love telling, which is in Ken Burns' Jazz, where there's an old white jazz critic, and he says, you know, I was brought up in the South, and I was taught that black people were an inferior species. And then one night I went into a club and I saw Pops, Satchelmouth, Louis Armstrong playing. And it was the first time I'd seen a genius.
Yeah.
And all of my, you know, the cognitive dissonance of going, I've been taught all this nonsense. I've been taught these people are apes. And here's this guy who is just utterly brilliant. And yes. I think, and that it had a great deal to do with the civil rights movement, that here were black people particularly playing jazz. Blues music really wasn't very influential on the white community until the Rolling Stones and the Beatles took it back. For some
speaking of civil rights movement, you may know that the move to end apartheid in South Africa, the music that was used to inspire the protesters and Nelson Mandela was jazz music.
Yeah, Miriam Makeba and
her, and especially a jazz guy who didn't play music with words. He was originally called Dollar Brand. That was his given name.
Abdullah Ibrahim.
Ibrahim. And one of his songs became sort of the theme song for the ANC and was played over and over. And I probably mentioned this little episode in one of our talks, but I was invited to give a speech at a Creativity and Madness conference in South Africa. And we were in a hotel and giving the presentation. And my wife sang part of Black and Blue, by Louis Armstrong, referencing Blacks in America and how depressed they can be.
Oh.
By the way, it would be hard for her to do that nowadays. She'd probably be slammed for appropriation. But anyways, it was fine at that time. This was maybe 10 years ago. And then I went on to play a cut by Nelson Mandela, about Nelson Mandela by the trumpeter Hugh Masekela. And
The great Hugh Masekela.
everybody starts to get up in the audience in the room dancing, and which was wonderful. But then I sort of hear something going on outside the door of the room. And I open the door to the room, and the whole hotel staff was out there dancing too. The music was just so uplifting, joyous, as we just mentioned, for everybody. So, and my presentation centered actually on Dollar Brand Abdullah Ibrahim's music, because it in itself was so uplifting, but it didn't have words. This particular piece had words, and so people just latched onto that. So one of my highest experience presenting anything anywhere. So
where in South Africa was that?
Cape Town.
Yeah, Cape Town's the only place in South Africa I've been. What a beautiful place.
Yeah, I think physically speaking, probably the most beautiful city we've ever seen. And we also had the opportunity, we went to like a small house party where the guy who owned the house was a jazz pianist. So we got him to play just in front of like 10, 15 people in his house. Just spectacular, just certainly joyousness of that music that still comes out of South Africa. So, yeah.
And
there's a new, by the way, again, speaking of joy, there's a new a cappella group that just came out of South Africa, and its name is The Joy. The Joy. And their recording is joyous and beautiful and worth anybody listening to.
I mean, let me look to this cultural appropriation idea. Duke Ellington refused to play Porgy and Bess because it was written by two white men, both of whom were Jewish, in fact. Louis Armstrong, as you say, with the great Ella Fitzgerald, the unparalleled Ella Fitzgerald, they recorded Porgy and Bess. Summertime, in fact, Porgy and Bess was a failure. It was released at the end of George Gershwin's life, and it flopped. And he would never know that his song "Summertime" is the most recorded song in the world.
Yes.
So this, so Ellington is commenting on the Black experience by saying, "I'm not going to play this. It's white music." I don't like that. I think there's something very wrong. Firstly, of course, because Ellington was a middle class Black from Washington, D.C., where his dad worked occasionally as a butler at the White House. He never picked cotton. He was not part of that. That Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald and so many others were willing to use it. The idea that jazz is a Black music, that jazz is an African-American music, when Armstrong this was said to Armstrong, he said, it's a Black music. And he said, Bix Beiderbecke. From his point of view, it was not something that belonged. It was something that, of course, has roots and is generated in that community. As I say, we don't know where it came from. Ken Burns has the view that it's probably a Creole music from New Orleans. And what happened was that under the Jim Crow rules, where Blacks and whites had to be segregated in these bizarre set of rules, there were musicians who'd been trained at the New Orleans Conservatoire who now had no work because they were Black. And they took their training and added it into this music that was coming out of the Black community and made it more sophisticated.
Yeah, it's that appropriation is tricky, especially in our day of cancel culture and so forth. I mean, I don't know, maybe Ellington brought that up too, because historically, when whites get involved with Black-derived music, including rock and roll, the whites' music records sell way better than the Black ones do. Just take the Rolling Stones and blues music. I mean, they made a fortune out of Black music, and the Black creators did not. And that's repeated over and over in history. So that's one underlying issue. Personally, I think it's appreciation, not appropriation. You know, people love the music, and so they want to play it, and they're not doing it primarily to make lots of money. They're doing it because they love the music. And so I think it's really destructive when you use appropriation to prevent people. And that's what came up in an indirect way in the book we were just talking about, that I was appropriating Eastern religions and spirituality by being the editor.
This book has just come out, Psychiatry and Eastern Religion and Spirituality, which you edited, which is a mammoth task, and which I contributed to in a piece I co-authored with Steve Hassan, to talk about some of the dangers and some of the things we need to watch out for.
Yeah, I was just doing it because I thought it was important in my own education, and valuing lots of colleagues who were Hindu or Buddhist or whatever. I admired how they approached religion. So, and then what I also discover along the way is that Hinduism was mainly one of the only big religions that was never anti-Semitic. And that was also true of some of the smaller Eastern religious traditions. So here we got a whole set of religions coming from a different part of the world at the same time the Western religions were developed, but not being anti-Semitic. And that was a learning experience for me, so valuable. And speaking of jazz, Jewish presence in jazz was also major. Part of it was owning the record companies, which was plus and minus, but also most of the early non-Black musicians were Jewish. And so, you know, I think Jews also identified with, you know, the racism that Blacks experienced by their own anti-Semitism that they experienced. So there's these interesting ties that Jews had to the music. But appropriation, I think, can actually be a problem, but hopefully more often than not, it's an appreciation, and it's something that we share together. Out of editing all these 4 books, what I thought should be a metaphor or model for the United States is not as a melting pot, but as a potluck dinner where people bring their best food, their best nourishment, both literally and figuratively. And that's the kind of America we want to become. And I hope, to me, that's my major wish, that the books reflected that all these religions have value if we use them to kind of enhance one another instead of being in conflict and rejection of other religions. So, yeah.
A pluralist society is the best society. One, you know, as Isaiah Berlin said, you know, the only thing we should be intolerant of is intolerance. But yeah, I have a couple of points to come up from that. Yes, there's been a lot of appropriation of you know, black rhythm and blues was appropriated and became white rock and roll. However, at the beginning of rock and roll, we had Little Richard, and who was just an unbelievable character, as he said, the king and queen of rock and roll. But I grew up listening to that music because I have a brother who had a career as a singer-songwriter, in fact, who under the name Andy Caven, a quite remarkable performer, incredible voice, wonderful rhythm guitar player, great songs, go out and buy the records. I even played on a couple of the records. But it meant that I was in a household where Buddy Holly and Eddie Cochran and Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis were being played. And it was only actually a couple of years ago, I'm very familiar with the early Little Richard catalogue. A couple of years ago, I heard some of the work that he did in the early 70s, and I didn't recognize his voice. I just went, whoa, what an incredible voice. But Little Richard did make some money along the way. And then, of course, we come to the generation of Michael Jackson, who becomes the highest, Jimi Hendrix, by the time of his death, was the highest paid entertainer in the world in 1970. So there has been, a move in black music where it's been very popular and very successful. I'm happy to say that's something that, up until really when the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Fleetwood Mac in the 60s took blues back to America. There's this story about the Beatles, their first trip to the US. They go to Chicago and they're asked what they want to see. And they said, Muddy Waters and Bo Diddley. And the white guide said, where are they? I've never heard of those places. That's how ignorant people were of these phenomenal artists. I think that has changed. And I think, Dr. Dre, I think, was the first billionaire black musician in the US. So I'm not really, I think he's a brilliant mixer, but I think some of those songs are a little bit unpleasant, a little bit.
Those two examples you gave are also kind of interesting from another cultural perspective. Both Little Richard and Michael Jackson, I think you mentioned this, had this kind of a ambiguous gender expression. Yeah. And I think that drew people in its own ways. It certainly didn't convey the stereotype that black men are dangerous, which has been a long-term, I think, problem, stereotype. So they were different. And I think they've helped that whole issue get better. By the way, I think some of the same history of development has happened in rap and hip hop. Basically, a black developed music, whites have come into it, women more. And I think the interesting part is hip hop and rap is still very, very popular in the black community, whereas the interest in jazz sort of died out over time as the music got more complex, I think. So in certain ways, rap and hip hop has taken jazz's place.
Well, I think so, and it's outsold rock music. Who knows what happens next? But I think you're right that with jazz. It said the breakthrough moment for jazz is this gig in Los Angeles by Benny Goodman in about 1934 or some time. And until that time, there's this distinction which we don't necessarily notice between what's called novelty music and jazz. So if you go back to Chick Webb and Ella Fitzgerald, there'd be a Tisket to Tasket or a Pedal in My Shoe or what have you. These are novelty songs. The people performing them don't think of them as jazz. And then there's this other music that we stay on after hours to play among ourselves, and this is jazz. Listening back, it's hard to differentiate because they'll take a great standard song, usually written by somebody Jewish, Irving Berlin onwards. I think Cole Porter is the only one of the great standards writers of the 20s and 30s who wasn't Jewish. But they'll take this song and they'll jazz it. And so jazz is an approach to music, which is this joyful, and it can be, the blues is also an aspect of jazz. Thinking about gender made me think about Billie Holiday, because Billie Holiday was bisexual, and also with songs like Strange Fruit was right there with the protest against the oppression of people. But you and I have talked about this before, and I think we're both of the point of view that we believe in equalism. We think it's time to get past the idea of what my grandfather did to your grandfather and move on to understand. And I think this is one of the most important points. In the 1990s, I really got into this, we're 1.7% genetically different from the chimp and the bonobo. So we will therefore behave either by beating things up or having sex with them, because that's what they do. And we're limited into this. And this is still widely believed. Yuval Harari, his book *Sapiens*, has this idea that we had these modules that developed on the savannah, and we can't help ourselves. The kind of Konrad Lorenz, we're all vicious animals under the skin. I really don't believe any of that anymore, and for me, that's very, very positive and very nurturing to say we can change our minds in a moment. We don't have to be racist. We don't have to be sexist. But most of all, we don't have to be hateful. We can be forgiving. We can. One of the most amazing stories I saw was a woman who had been in the Provisional Irish Republican Army, the IRA, and she'd been part of a team that captured a man who was a volunteer police officer, a special in the Royal Ulster Constabulary. They strapped him into the driving seat of a van. They put a bomb in the van, and then they pushed the van down the hill, and it blew up. She left the IRA at that point. She said, "This is what have I done? What am I doing?" Some years later, during the Truth and Reconciliation process in Northern Ireland, she was invited to a meeting where the wife of this police officer would be, and the trepidation she felt, you can imagine. And she went there, and this woman embraced her. It's done. We can finish this, and we can only go forward by not hating each other, and also to some extent by not accepting guilt that doesn't belong to us. If you're in a family that's wealthy, like the Trevelyan family in this country, they've made a gift. Laura Trevelyan is a BBC presenter. They've made a gift to a Caribbean island because they kept slaves, and so their current wealth derives from slavery and sugar. I think in that situation, there is an argument for reparations to be made.
Yeah.
Regular people like you and me who don't really have that much money and didn't benefit directly from that, we should be looking to have a community of equality, of equal opportunity, equal education. Sort of thing. Yeah.
That's the key. That's the key. I think are ways for us to overcome our tendency to fear the other and want to dominate them, but it takes kind of ongoing effort and ways of relating that overcomes it, like you just brought up. Going back to what we were talking about with jazz, there's a couple other examples of democratic precedents in jazz, and so a little thread runs through it. Even Jimmy Carter, for that matter, he invited, among other jazz members, Cecil Taylor to come and play at the White House. Cecil Taylor is probably the most avant-garde jazz artist there ever was, but Jimmy Carter invited him and some other jazz guys. But he wasn't necessarily a hardcore jazz fan. Bill Clinton was, and he played jazz saxophone. And I think what I never heard of until recently, Barack Obama loved jazz, and his speechwriter ended up writing an article about how, when he was trying to write the first State of the Union speech for Obama, and it wasn't going so well, Obama told him, listen to John Coltrane while you're writing. Then later on in the speech writing, he wrote what he thought was beautifully incorporating all the important points, which Obama agreed to. And then he said, now listen to Miles Davis, because you need to figure what should be left out, where there should be silences.
Economy, yeah.
The speech, just like Miles Davis playing. Maybe the most important parts of his playing was when he provided silences between the notes he played. So there's this interesting thread in the Democratic Party in modern times for their interest in jazz and what it meant. That I think maybe will become more appreciated now, because it's starting to come out in the open.
Yeah, a friend of mine plays congas in a band called Funkadisi in Chicago. They've been around a long time.
What's it called?
Funkadisi. Single word, Funkadisi. Funkadesi, Funkadisi. And they're great. They're, if you want something that's multicultural, you have a dub reggae guy, you have an Indian singer, a South Asian singer, and all this stuff going. And in fact, Barack Obama is one of their fans. So I bring that up because of that, and has made public statements about how great their music is, and it is. So again, rush out and buy that. And JFK, I think, gave a presidential award to the blues artist Josh White, who is somebody who has not played enough. I mean, people sort of go back and they'll listen to Robert Johnson, as we all should. But Lonnie Johnson, the just unbelievable guitar, jazz and blues guitar player of 20s and 30s. And Josh White, I think, underappreciated. Josh White did something that a few blues artists did. And he'd go into the studio in the morning and record as the singing Christian and put out these songs as the singing Christian. And then in the afternoon, he'd record a song like Little Brother about how effective his knife was, which is a scary song. But yeah, this integration.
That was a dilemma for black musicians back in the day. Maybe still is, Are you singing for the devil or are you singing for God? And the devil music was blues and gospel was, the appropriate music. And
why is it the devil has the best tunes?
Right. Symphony for the Devil by the Rolling Stones, right? Great song.
It is. It's wonderful. And I think that's a very important point, this idea that there's a music for God and a music for the devil. And I really don't think it's true. I think I can understand that there's this kind of division that happened in black culture, that you had the black artists typically in the teens and 20s and into the 30s of the last century. They would play at a juke joint on a Saturday night where there'd be, up until the repeal of the Volstead Act in 33, there'd be drinking and violence. These were not necessarily good places to be. And then on a Sunday, they'd go and play at a white picnic. And so you find somebody like, say, Blind Lemon Jefferson, one of the originators of the blues back in Texas, or Huddie Ledbetter, that they're not blues artists. They sing blues, but they'll sing anything because they're being paid to entertain. You also have maybe, there's this idea that maybe guitar blues came about because it was setting a rhythm for cotton picking, and they'd be hired to jump down, turn around, pick a bale of cotton and that kind of stuff. All of these streams flow together to create a music. And by the 30s, some of these blues artists, Robert Johnson, for example, he had his own Model T Ford. He could afford to have a car.
Popular music at the time, yes.
Would that he had lived another 50 years, but we lost him.
Right, yeah. And again, the connection of jazz to other kinds of music and being able to incorporate other musics around the world. John Coltrane, before he, I think, became really, really popular, got enamored with Indian music from India. And that if you listen to his most popular song, My Favorite Things, it's like he's playing a raga. That sort of style of music. And it enhanced his whole development of music. And then going back to our talk about religion and Eastern religions, his most popular album is called A Love Supreme, and it's ecumenical. It's a love song to all religions, really, and it has kind of a basis again of Indian music connected to jazz. So when you bring these things together, the potential for enhancement is really present. As long as you can bring these things together in a positive and inspiring way, again, instead of being critical of any kind of connections like that.
I mean, when I was a kid, way back in the last century, in the early 70s, I was deeply taken by Miles Davis's alumnus, John McLaughlin, and still am. And McLaughlin, of course, became a follower of the Sri Chinmoy cult. I'm going to call it that. I'm not happy about the way it behaved. But nonetheless, it was a setting for him and has remained so, that he's been a committed Hindu. But musically, you listen to this incredibly difficult music. Pat Metheny, the great guitarist, Pat Metheny said the 70s was about learning to play as fast as John McLaughlin and realizing it's impossible. So Al Di Meola and maybe Alan Holdsworth managed to get to that level, but very few people of that dexterity. But this wasn't just a show-off music. I think sometimes bebop becomes look how incredibly brilliant I am sort of music, and they are. But with McLaughlin, it's melodically structured, The playing is very difficult, and even where it's improvised, you'll have a group of maybe 3 instrumentalists, a keyboard player, a violinist, and a guitar player in the original Mahavishnu Orchestra, riffing around each other. And, it's scarily complicated. Years later, and I've seen McLaughlin 3 times over the years and listened to a tremendous amount of his music. Years later, I saw him explaining the basis for his composition. And he said, well, he'd learned the Indian rhythmic structure, which is underneath all. It's one of the aspects of all Indian music, that they construct things in 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s. So you get this da, da, tick, tick, da, da, tick, tick, da, 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 da. So you'll have a rhythmic structure. He writes on top of that. And indeed, many musicians use rhythmic structures to start from and work their way through. But it's a kind of key to his music that you find this is why they can play, in 27 time or what have you, and make it sound, melodic and harmonious to listen to. And that, of course, with Shakti, he made 3 albums with Lakshmi Narayam, commonly known as L. Shankar, that just like this, whoa, you're kidding me. This guy played in the Frank Zappa band. He later played with Peter Gabriel and Bruce Springsteen, but he's a Southern Indian violinist and, with a doctor of music, was a doctor of musicology. He had Zakir Hussain playing tabla for him, the great Alaraka's son, and a guy called Viku, Vinakrayam, playing a clay pot. And these 3 albums is actually the only part of McLaughlin I don't really listen to. I listen to those 3 musicians and their own music. But this incredible complexity where East and Western music just fuse together.
Yeah, it's tricky though, isn't it? I think you've alluded to this. The music can be fascinating and interesting just for its technique, right? Yeah. No question about that. Maybe Wynton Marsalis nowadays is at the top of the technical game. But the added addition that really, I think, makes jazz so strong is when you could sense the emotional content.
Yes.
Besides the technique. And so for me, the emotional content is mainly why I love the music so much. It almost feels therapeutic at times to put on something that's soothing for the way I'm feeling, or I want to be inspired. And I thought about this because of your mentioning John McLaughlin, because my favorite playing of him, and I saw this live, was with Tony Williams, the drummer, and Larry Young, the organist. And they played live. Yeah. This was probably 1969 or 1970 in New York. And the first song they played was one called Emergency. And I think what they were conveying is the emergency of all the civil rights stuff going on at the time. This is emergency. This is how we feel about it. And besides each of them having great technique, the emotional stuff came through that just pulled you in if you could stay with it. Some people were overwhelmed and walked out, but the music was just so powerful emotionally. And so that's my favorite thing of anything I ever heard him play.
Yeah, I mean, Tony Williams, there's nothing better than, I'm a drummer, there's nothing better than Tony Williams. Nothing ever could be. I've recently become very interested in some Irish music, having managed to avoid and ignore Irish music for a lifetime. A group who call themselves the Gloaming, and they're a collection. In fact, one of them is now dead. They've been around for 20 years. I didn't know about them. But they have a phenomenal violin player called Martin Hayes and a guitar player called Dennis Cahill. And they made an album together. I've gone, and as I always do, I'll hear something and go, I need everything. Go onto Amazon Marketplace, what can I get for £10? Yeah. And so I've got quite a lot of material, and I went after every member of the group because they're all so incredibly brilliant. There's an American pianist called Thomas Bartlett, who I think we will be comparing to Keith Jarrett in the future. He is that good. He's got that sensitivity of touch.
What's his name again? What's his name?
Thomas Bartlett.
Bartlett. The reason I'm asking you is we're having our Irish Festival in Milwaukee this weekend. It's the biggest Irish festival in the world. So look for him and see if he's playing there. But so
But
I'll go see him.
Martin Hayes in Ireland, there's some sort of annual competition for violinists playing reels and jigs, and he wins it fundamentally. They also work with a guy called Caoimhín O'Reilly. These are from AS or Irish spellings, and I have to work it. Caoimhín O'Reilly, and he plays an instrument which he calls a Hardanger Amor. Now, this is the Hardanger fiddle, the Norwegian fiddle, has 4 strings and 4 sympathetic strings.
Yeah.
It used to be forbidden to take one into a church because it's considered a devil's instrument.
Okay.
And you have the Buen family. There's a violinist called Hawk Buen who is great. It just has the strangest sound. Well, Caoimhín O'Reilly, he had a viola built, a viola d'amore, on the Hardanger principle. So it has 5 strings and 5 sympathetics, and it just makes the most. So he is part of the glamoring as well. So he may be around. Anyway, Martin Hayes and Dennis Cahill, the guitar player, made a beautiful album called The Lonesome Touch. And in the sleeve notes, Martin Hayes explains, that there every now and then you get the lonesome touch, this point that is emotionally completely transcendent, and that he seeks that in his work. And he makes a specific point. He's very well known for his technique. He is a remarkable virtuoso. He says that's not what matters. And he talks about the fiddlers he learned from. And he says it's about getting that feeling. And whenever this comes up, and people have, in the past, somebody was saying, oh, you're just interested in music, it's really difficult to play. And it's like, no, I'm interested in music, full stop. And I get people to go, there's a recording made in the early 1960s, it's on YouTube, of Son House playing Death Letter. Son House is...
I saw him at the end of his life. He was incredible, overwhelming. Yeah,
and he doesn't so much play as punish the guitar, but you connect completely with what he's saying. So go away from that and then listen to some K-pop or some of the kind of overly smoothed music that is being pumped out at the moment, and remember that music is about the heart. It's not about hands or the head. It's about the heart. It's whether it moves you. And we find that in all of the great musics.
Yes.
I mean, mentioning Miriam Makeba, the other week I saw a documentary about Paul Simon, and there was a little clip, presumably from the Graceland tours, where she starts scat singing. And I have never seen anything like it. It was just the most beautiful thing that she's making these humming noises, and so all about feel.
Yep. Music is the healing force of the universe, as the jazz saxophonist Albert Ayler always said. So,
I mean, Jimi Hendrix said that music is the only universal language, and he spoke about his music being an electric church where anybody could worship. And you cut through all of the interpretations, all of the attempts to persuade you to hate other people, to divide yourself from other people, into this joyful crowd, which we occasionally have seen. I had the good fortune in 1970 to be at the Isle of Wight Festival, where Hendrix played one of his last gigs. But to be in a crowd of, there were 600,000 people there. And it's a verifiable thing because you had to catch a ferry to get there. So there were 600,000 people there. And as the police said at the end of the week, that there were no arrests for violence. Yeah. This was like a city, and I think 80 people were arrested, all on drugs charges. So that idea that amount of people can come together joyfully, and the only person that I saw get upset there was Joni Mitchell.
That never happens at outdoor jazz concerts. You never have riots, except once in Newport, Rhode Island, people who wanted to get in, young people, knocked down a fence to get in. But I could see why, because they were pretty poor. By the way, the other music we haven't touched upon that has another reminder to me of joy is classical music, right? So Beethoven's last major piece,
Ode
famous,
to Joy.
and I mean, Ode to Joy, right? I mean, and if you don't feel joy when you're listening to that, whether you like classical music or not, you're tone deaf or emotionally tone deaf. It's so uplifting, and um, if if I need to be uplifted at any time, I might go to just hearing that excerpt from the piece because it's so powerful and uplifting. So classical music can have it too, of course,
Any kind of music.
uh, any kind of music can have that combination of good technique and emotional resonance. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I mean, I would definitely, to anybody who hasn't heard it, I would recommend Frederick Delius as a classical composer. And Delius is said the Walk to Paradise Garden. I mean, people often start with on hearing the first Cuckoo in Spring, which is also Summer Evening on the River. There are lots of these wonderful pieces. But he's fascinating because
Nature pieces, huh?
sorry,
Sort of. Nature pieces, nature.
Yeah, they're sort of they're actually largely they're part instrumental pieces from his operas that have become popular, and they're usually separated out. But if you want to be soothed, if you need to relax from the troubles of the world, these or Mahler's Adagietto from the Fifth Symphony, which was a love poem to his wife Alma, which is just a beautiful thing. But with Delius, he, as a young man of 20, went to Florida. His parents were German, but he was born and grew up in England. And then he went to run an orange grove in Florida. And in the evenings, and this is, I think, 1882, somewhere around there, so he's 2021. In the evenings, he would hear the black workers singing. And he heard this and went, I've got to become a composer. So this is the first time, I mean, we have W.C. Handy in 1900 talking about the blues. This is 18 years before this. A European hears this beautiful black music and says, I've got to become a composer. And you can feel that, that his music is about serenity,
Well, you also mentioned he was in an orange grove. And the reason I was asking you about nature is because we just heard or watched this great play called The Secret Garden. It's after the book of its name, which I think is originally by an English novelist, a woman from over 100 years ago, right?
Right, yeah.
But pretty soon a book is coming out called Nature Therapy. I happen to have a chapter in it on being a climate activist, but so much more hardcore research now is saying, get out in nature, at least when there's not a storm, get out in nature. It's therapeutic for you. And it's such a contrast to staying inside and just looking at the internet all day long. And it's so good for kids to be out in nature. And so, lots of composers have also been inspired by being in nature. I think, what's another English guy that I like? Ralph Williams. Wow.
Ralph Vaughan Williams.
Yeah. I mean, he writes from his experience, I think, with nature very movingly.
Again, the Lark Ascending by Vaughan.
That's it. That's it. I was trying to think of it. Yeah, that's it.
Or Bela Bartok. Yeah. I mean, the whole romantic movement in the 19th century, where landscape, you sort of think, well, there have always been landscape paintings. No, it's only really with John Constable and, that the people move off the stage and you just have nature. I mean, you can go back to, what's his name? There's a French painter who precedes that. But landscape became a thing, and then you get the great, scenes of mountains, and then the wonderful photographs of American national parks that come along, and this sense that we might belong in this place. I find storms quite reassuring too. I was out in a 100-mile per hour.
I sort of like them too, but I
Can
don't
be a
want
bit
to
dangerous.
put dangerous by recommending.
Keep hold of the rope and don't stand under a tree.
Yeah,
That's the advice to them. But yeah, I think the artificial world. I'm told that Kant said that we live in the world, but we actually live each of us in our own interpretation of the world, and I think that's very true. And that the more synthetic and artificial that world becomes, the more anxious we become, the less able to just let go and
yeah,
appreciate being alive and how wonderful that is, wherever it's going and whatever's going to happen to us along the way. The
yes,
privilege of not being a rock, or a centipede, that having this apparatus through which we can appreciate
yes.
the world is quite remarkable. So yeah, I'm all for nature therapy. My wife is very, she likes to walk every day,
Well,
and that's a
well, half
great
of it,
experience. You're looking at the garden, you're looking at the plants, you're looking at the world, you're listening to the birds, you're watching the butterflies. Moment we have dragonflies in the garden, and it's just amazing watching these creatures.
you keep saying these things that resonate with me. I wish you'd say something I disagree with, but anyways,
I'll work on it.
you just mentioned two or three things that resonate so much. First of all, your wife walking out in nature and so forth. Um, but you just touched upon dragonflies. Well, before I get to dragonflies, the photos you send me of your flowers are also so uplifting, even though they're a photo and not the real thing. I just love them.
Thank you.
But dragonflies, so last summer, one of the days at the end of last summer, our yard was literally filled with dragonflies flying all over the place, swarms of them. And it was so fascinating and lovely in its own unusual way that my wife has decided to name our house and our yard Dragonfly Ranch. And we keep collecting anything that has to do with dragonflies.
Okay.
So it's like all of a sudden, this beautiful experience in nature hit us and continues because we, even though dragonflies aren't coming around so far this year, we've got pictures of them all over the house and little sculptures of dragonflies, and it's wonderful. And
Yeah.
they're good because they eat things that are helpful to be eaten. So
Yeah, and they're also, it's said that they're the most effective of all hunters, that 98% of the time when they go after something, they catch it. Whereas I think a leopard only manages about 30% of the time. But
really,
I'm not really sure that a dragonfly could beat a leopard, though, so that could be complicated. But they are, as a photographer, they're the hardest things to photograph because they won't stay still.
yeah, they swarm fast.
We get the smaller ones, the damselflies. We this year we haven't got as many. We usually have tens of them. I mean, and they're kind of electric blue or a very vivid green, particularly. But I got interested because I kept trying to get a shot of them, and you have to get them in perspective. You're using a macro lens. You have to have them, if they're angled away from the lens at all, part of it will be out of focus. So not only getting them to sit still, but getting to an angle where you've got them. And I finally, last year, managed to get two, and that's it, in years of trying, two reasonable photographs of damselflies. But it made me go off and try and identify them, and I didn't realize there were so many different types. Yeah. But we have a pond, and the thing is have a pond and have some little vertical things so they can climb up out of the water. And they will eat the mosquitoes. If you want something to keep down mosquitoes, this is it. And they're not harmful to us. You'd notice it if one bit you, but I've never met anybody who's been bitten by one, and they're not poisonous in any way. So, do you know the song, the Danny Kirwan song, Dragonfly?
No.
Fleetwood Mac.
Oh, okay.
The second guitar player in Fleetwood Mac, Danny Kirwan, wrote this lovely song, Dragonfly. I'll send you a link to it.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Wow. We've had fun today.
Yeah, wow. We got topics, connected topics, but yeah, surprising for I don't know, for a mental health site.
Well,
To talk about this site stuff, yeah.
I'm, I've always intended that my site would be about all of the things I'm interested in. And the
Good.
problem is that, if I do something about Scientology, then I might get 20,000 views on it. But I've started kind of going, well, I want to talk with interesting people. I don't really want to be going over the same stuff over and over again. And I'm passionate about art, cinema, music, photography, nature, climate change. I'm passionate about 100 things, as I think most people really are when it comes down to it, that this is the world we're living in. So last week, because John Mayall died at age 90, and I just went, I can't not talk about this, because John Mayall, I was about 12 years old when I first heard John Mayall, and he's my bridge from pop music into blues. Hendrix, I was listening to Hendrix, I was listening to Cream at that time. But John Mayall, something about it not being ever a commercial music. He did have a few hits and he made enough money, but there was a sincerity about him. This guy who, he was 30 years old, I think, when he finally moved to London to become a professional musician. He then has Eric Clapton, Peter Green, Mick Taylor, Stones guitar player, Ainsley Dunbar, Keith Hartley, John McVie, Mick Fleetwood, the Fleetwood and the Mac of Fleetwood Mac. Just through Coco Montoya, it was like the Miles Davis band. Somebody, in fact, commented on the video I put up, like Miles Davis. Everyone and anyone who was brilliant went through this group. If you could say, I played with Miles or I played with John Mayall, there are your credentials, So, and interesting, I sort of just did a short piece to camera just to say, everybody go out and listen to Blues from Laurel Canyon. It's one of the great achievements of humanity, I think. And as a drummer, Colin Allen's drumming on it, and Colin Allen Stone the Crows and Focus, and he wrote some songs which made him some money, but drummers don't listen to him. And you're going, this guy's really got it. He's in the pocket, But with Mick Taylor playing guitar, aged, 19 or something, and one of the great blues guitar players of all time. And these wonderful songs where Mayall actually writes this concept album about a holiday he had in Los Angeles, and all fantastic. But I thought I've got to say something about this, because, I need to talk about what's important. And so today, the great pleasure of talking about music and, improvising on the subject of jazz. I'm old enough now that I shouldn't be doing boring things. I should be doing stuff like this.
That's right.
Exciting.
I agree.
Great. Well, we should probably allow our listeners to go home now. And this has been a tremendous pleasure, as ever, Steve. So thank you, Dr. Jazz.
Yeah. Well, we kind of did the show just like jazz music. I mean, we weren't planning to do this. We just got up there and started to improvise and took it all the way through. So, yeah.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Great. So thanks, everybody, for watching. And please write pleasant comments and correct me if I'm wrong about anything. That's always
hard to find. Yeah.
I'd like to clarify something I did say about Joni Mitchell, which is the only person who got upset at the Isle of Wight was Joni Mitchell. She did. She told us off. And I'd just like to say that last night I was actually watching an interview with her where she explained that, being alone with the guitar on stage and a huge audience was a terrifying thing for her. And I'd also like to say that I think that she is possibly the most remarkable songwriter of the generation. I absolutely revere the work of Joni Mitchell. So I hope she hasn't taken offense at what I said.
Probably not. And of course, one of her, in my mind, greatest records, or maybe her greatest, was her collaboration with Charles Mingus, who we started off talking about. So they did a record together, and
it's a wonderful piece. And of course, he contacted her and said, I'd like you to put words to my tunes. And She did. There's a wonderful live performance of many of those songs called Shadows and Light, which had Pat Metheny and Lyle Mays playing on it, Don Elias, and of course, Jaco Pastorius.
Yeah, he's amazing. Was amazing.
Yeah.
Died once.
And such a shame that his mental condition led him to an early death, getting himself in a barroom brawl. But what a body of work he left. I've been back through the albums he made and the work he did with Gil Evans, for example. Just a brilliant musician. But on that point, Joni Mitchell, maybe Don Juan's Reckless Daughter as well, which is her first meeting with Pastorius. Wayne Shorter of Weather Report also plays on there. So lots of good things to go and listen to and take joy from.
Sure, for sure. Yeah,
we'll maybe talk about catharsis in music later, because that's useful too.
Yeah.
Right. Thanks so much, Steve.
Thank you. Till we meet again.
Till we meet again.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
Why is it the devil has the best tunes?